The studio lights blazed down on the familiar set of Steve Harvey's talk show, casting their usual warm glow across the burgundy chairs and polished wooden desk. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday afternoon taping, another episode in the endless cycle of celebrity interviews, heartwarming stories, and Steve's signature brand of wisdom mixed with humor. The audience was settling in, their excited chatter filling the air as they waited for the cameras to roll. Steve Harvey adjusted his tie, a bright purple number that matched his pocket square, and glanced at his notes one final time. Today's guest was different from the usual lineup of Hollywood stars and viral internet personalities. Captain Ibrahim Traore, the young military leader from Burkina Faso, had agreed to appear via satellite link from Ouagadougou. At just 34 years old, Traoré had become one of Africa's most talked-about leaders, known for his anti-colonial stance and his passionate speeches about African sovereignty. "All right, family," Steve said to his audience, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made him America's favorite TV dad. "Today we're doing something a little different.
We're talking to a young man who's stirring up conversations all around the world."
Some folks love him, some folks got questions, but one thing's for sure, he's got something to say, and we're gonna listen.
The satellite connection crackled to life on the large screen behind Steve's desk.
There sat Ibrahim Traore, dressed in his characteristic military fatigues, his youthful face serious but not stern. The contrast was striking. Steve in his perfectly tailored suit on a polished Hollywood set, and Traoré in what appeared to be a simple office in West Africa. "Captain Traoré, welcome to the show, brother," Steve began, his voice taking on that respectful tone he reserved for guests he genuinely admired. "First off, let me just say, you got people talking. At 34 years old, you're leading a country, you're standing up to some powerful folks, and you're doing it with a conviction that's got the whole world watching."
"Tell Stati Uniti, what drives you?"
Traoré's response came through the satellite delay, his English accented but clear. "Mr. Harvey, thank you for having me. What drives me is simple. I cannot sleep peacefully knowing that children in my country go to bed hungry while our resources flow to enrich others. I cannot accept that young Africans must risk their lives crossing deserts and oceans to find opportunities that should exist in their homeland." The studio audience was unusually quiet. This wasn't the typical feel-good banter they were used to. Steve leaned forward in his chair, sensing the weight of the moment. "Now, you've been critical of some Western policies in Africa," Steve continued. "You've called out France. You've talked about economic colonialism. That's some heavy accusations, young man. Help our audience understand what you mean by that." Traoré's eyes seemed to look directly through the camera, as if he could see each person in the studio audience. "Mr. Harvey, imagine if China came to America and said, 'We will take all your oil, your gold, your agricultural products. In return, we will give you roads and hospitals, but you must use Chinese companies, Chinese workers, and pay us back with interest.' Then, when American leaders try to change this arrangement, they are removed from power or their countries face economic sanctions. This is what has happened in Africa for decades." Steve nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. That's a perspective we don't often hear on American television, Captain. But let me ask you this. You're talking about changing systems that have been in place for generations.
That is a dangerous work.
Aren't you afraid? You got a family. You got people depending on you. Don't you worry about what might happen. For the first time, Traoré's composed demeanor shifted slightly. A shadow passed across his face, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press against the studio walls. "Mr. Harvey, let me tell you something that I have never shared publicly before." The satellite delay seemed longer now, the silence in the studio absolute. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. 3 months ago, I received a call at 2 in the morning. My security team told me that my 8-year-old daughter, Amina, had been taken from her school.
Steve's eyes widened.
The audience gasped audibly. This was not in the pre-interview notes. "They kept her for 18 hours, Traoré continued, his voice steady but his hands now clasped tightly together. 18 hours where I did not know if I would ever see my child again. The message was clear: change your policies, stop your anti-French rhetoric, or lose what matters most to you. Steve had conducted thousands of interviews over his career. He had heard stories of triumph and tragedy, joy and heartbreak. But something about this moment felt different. The studio, usually filled with the quiet hum of equipment and the shuffle of audience members, was completely silent. "What happened to your daughter?" Steve asked, his voice barely above a whisper.
"By the grace of God, we found her."
"She was unharmed physically, but—" Traoré paused, and for the first time, his voice cracked slightly. "When I held her in my arms that night, she looked at me and said, 'Papa, why do bad men want to hurt us because you want to help our people?' How do you explain to an 8-year-old that wanting your country to control its own resources makes you an enemy to some of the most powerful nations on Earth?" Steve felt something shift inside his chest. In all his years of television, all his years of trying to inspire and uplift people, he had never heard anything quite like this. Here was a man, younger than his own sons, carrying the weight of an entire nation while grappling with threats to his family that most people couldn't imagine. "Captain," Steve said, his voice catching slightly, "I got to be honest with you, brother. I'm sitting here in this comfortable studio, in this blessed country, and I'm realizing that I don't know nothing about the kind of pressure you're under. How do you keep going?" Traoré was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his words came slowly, deliberately. "Mr. Harvey, I keep going because I have seen what giving up looks like. I have been to villages where children have never seen a doctor, where mothers watch their babies die from diseases that cost pennies to cure. I have seen young men with university degrees selling phone cards on street corners because there are no jobs, while foreign companies extract billions of dollars worth of resources from beneath their feet." He paused, looking directly into the camera. "But more than that, I keep going because of a promise I made to my grandmother before she died. She was born under French colonial rule. She lived through independence, watched as new flags were raised and new anthems were sung, only to see the same exploitation continue under different names. On her deathbed, she made me promise that I would not let my daughter grow up in the same chains, even if those chains are painted gold and called partnership." Steve felt his throat tighten. He glanced at his audience and saw tears in many eyes. This was not what anyone had expected when they came to a taping of Steve Harvey's talk show that afternoon. "Your grandmother," Steve said softly. "What was her name?"
Fatimata Traore.
"She cleaned houses for French colonial administrators. She raised 7 children while their father worked in gold mines controlled by European companies. She never learned to read, but she understood economics better than most Harvard graduates. What would she say to you now?" Traoré smiled for the first time during the interview, and the warmth of it seemed to reach across the satellite connection. "She would say, 'Ibrahim, you talk too much.'"
Action speaks louder than words.
The audience chuckled softly, the tension breaking momentarily. But Steve could see that Traoré wasn't finished. "Mr. Harvey, may I share something else with your audience? Something that I think Americans need to understand." "Of course, brother."
This is your time. Ido notate America.
"I do not hate France or any Western country. I hate systems that keep people poor while making others rich through exploitation. I hate policies that force African mothers to bury children who could have lived if our resources stayed in our communities. And I hate that speaking these truths makes me a target." Traoré leaned closer to his camera, his intensity palpable even through the screen. "There are Americans right now, good people like those in your audience, who have no idea that their tax dollars support policies that keep African children hungry. There are French citizens who would be horrified to know that their comfortable lives are built partly on systems that extract wealth from some of the poorest people on Earth." Steve nodded, feeling the weight of these words settle over the studio. So what's the solution, Captain? What would you say to folks watching this who want to help but don't know how? Question your governments.
Question your media.
When you hear that an African leader is destabilizing the region or threatening Western interests, ask yourself, what interests? Whose interests? When you hear that we need international intervention to bring democracy and stability, ask yourself, were we consulted about what democracy and stability look like for us? The passion in Traoré's voice was building now, and Steve could feel it resonating through the studio. This was not a politician giving talking points. This was a man speaking from a place of deep conviction and personal pain.
Mr. Harvey, I want to tell your audience about my friend Ousmane.
He was a brilliant engineer who graduated top of his class from university. He spoke 4 languages fluently and had innovative ideas for renewable energy projects that could have transformed our country. He tried for 3 years to get funding for his projects from international development organizations. They told him his ideas were not aligned with current development priorities and offered instead to fund programs to teach rural Africans basic hygiene. Steve shook his head, understanding the frustration in Traoré's voice.
Ousmane now works as a taxi driver in Paris.
He sends money back to his mother and sister, like millions of other educated Africans who were forced to leave their continent because they couldn't find opportunities at home. This is the brain drain that keeps Africa dependent. And when leaders like me try to create those opportunities at home, we are called authoritarian or anti-Western. The studio was completely quiet now. Steve realized that his audience was hearing perspectives they had never encountered before, and he could see the impact on their faces. Captain, I got to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me and with this audience. Are you afraid you're going to be killed for what you're doing?
The question hung in there like a physical presence.
Traoré was quiet for so long that Steve wondered if the satellite connection had been lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Mr. Harvey, in the past 60 years, over 20 African leaders who challenged Western economic interests have died under suspicious circumstances or been removed from power through coups or invasions. Thomas Sankara, who tried to make Burkina Faso self-sufficient, was assassinated at 37. Patrice Lumumba, who wanted Congo to control its own minerals, was killed at 35. Muammar Gaddafi, whatever his faults, was murdered after he tried to create an African currency that would have freed us from dependence on Western financial systems. Steve felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of what this young man was carrying became clearer with each word. So yes, Mr. Harvey, I am afraid. Every morning when I wake up, I wonder if this will be the day. Every time I kiss my daughter goodbye, I wonder if it will be the last time. But I am more afraid of living with the knowledge that I could have made a difference and chose comfort instead. The satellite connection flickered slightly, and for a moment Steve panicked that they might lose the connection. But Traoré's image stabilized, and he continued. There is something else I want to share with your audience, something that happened just last week. I was visiting a rural clinic that we built with revenues from a gold mine that we nationalized, took back control of from a French company. The clinic serves 15 villages and has already saved hundreds of lives. Steve leaned forward, sensing another powerful moment approaching. An elderly woman approached me there. She was carrying her granddaughter, a little girl about the same age as my Amina.
The woman grabbed my hands and started crying.
Through her tears, she told me that this was the first time in 70 years that she had seen a clinic in her village that was built by Africans, for Africans, with African resources. Traoré paused, and Steve could see him struggling with emotion. Then she said something that broke my heart and gave me strength at the same time. She said, "My son, I have lived long enough to see the day when our children can be treated in their own homeland with medicine bought with their own wealth. If they kill you tomorrow, you will die knowing that you gave us this day." Steve felt tears welling up in his eyes. The studio audience was completely silent, many openly weeping. This was not entertainment anymore. This was witnessing something profound and real. "Captain," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "I got to tell you something, brother. I've been doing television for decades. I've interviewed presidents and celebrities. I've heard every kind of story you can imagine. But sitting here listening to you, man, I feel like I've been living in a bubble." Steve stood up from his chair and walked closer to the screen, as if trying to bridge the distance between Chicago and Ouagadougou.
"You know what is crazy,"
Steve continued, his voice growing stronger. "We got all kinds of problems here in America. We got poverty, we got injustice, we got young people struggling to find their way. But you're dealing with all of that, plus you got people trying to kill you for wanting to help your own people. That takes a kind of courage that I don't know if I got." Traoré shook his head. "Mr. Harvey, you have more courage than you know. You have used your platform to inspire millions of people, to give them hope when they had none. You have lifted up young people and shown them possibilities they couldn't see. That is courage too. But here's what I want to know," Steve said, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. "What can we do? What can regular folks watching this show do to help?" Traoré's eyes lit up with hope for the first time during the interview. "First, they can educate themselves about what is really happening in Africa. Not the stereotypes, not the charity commercials showing only poverty and despair, but the real stories of innovation, resilience, and potential." He leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera now. "Second, they can support African businesses and initiatives that are led by Africans. When you buy coffee, cocoa, or other products from Africa, find out if the farmers are getting fair prices or if middlemen are taking most of the profits. Third," Traoré continued, his voice gaining momentum, "they can pressure their representatives to examine American foreign policy in Africa. Ask why the United States has military bases in over a dozen African countries. Ask why American taxpayer money goes to support regimes that suppress their own people as long as they keep Western corporations happy." Steve nodded vigorously.
"That is a real talk right there."
"What else?" "Most importantly, they can change the narrative. When you hear about Africa in your media, notice if the stories are only about war, poverty, and corruption, or if they also show the doctors, engineers, artists, and entrepreneurs who are building the future. When you see African leaders portrayed as dictators or puppets, ask yourself, who benefits from that portrayal?" The passion in Traoré's voice was infectious. Steve could feel the energy shifting in the studio, from sadness to hope, from helplessness to possibility. "You know what, Captain?" Steve said, his voice rising.
"You got me thinking about something."
"We always talk about the American dream, about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, about working hard and building something better for your children. But what you're describing, wanting your country to control its own resources, wanting your children to have opportunities at home, that's the same dream, isn't it?" "Exactly, Mr. Harvey. The only difference is that when Americans fought for independence from Britain, they were celebrated as patriots. When Africans fight for true independence from neo-colonial systems, we are called threats to stability." Steve slapped his hand on his desk, the sound echoing through the studio. "Man, that's powerful. That's really powerful." The interview had been going on for over an hour now, far longer than the typical segment. But nobody in the studio seemed to notice or care. This was one of those rare moments when television transcended entertainment and became something more important. "Captain, I got one more question for you, and then I want to give you a chance to say anything else you want to say to America." Steve paused, collecting his thoughts. "You talked about your daughter, about the threats to your family. If something happens to you, if these powerful forces you're fighting against succeed in stopping you, what legacy do you want to leave behind?" Traoré was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire studio. "Mr. Harvey, I want to be remembered not as a perfect leader, because I am not perfect, but as someone who refused to accept that African children should have less than any other children in the world. I want to be remembered as someone who believed that dignity is not negotiable, that sovereignty is not a privilege to be granted by others, but a right to be claimed. He paused, looking directly into the camera as if he could see into the homes of everyone watching. But more than being remembered, I want to inspire others to continue this work. I want young Africans to know that they don't have to leave their continent to chase dreams. They can build those dreams at home. I want them to know that being African is not something to overcome or apologize for, but something to be proud of. Steve felt something breaking open inside his chest. The emotion was overwhelming, but he pressed on. And what would you say to young people around the world who are watching this and feeling inspired but maybe feeling hopeless about their own situations? Traoré smiled, and this time the warmth in his expression seemed to light up the entire screen. I would tell them what my grandmother told me. The river that moves mountains does not do it in one day, but it never stops flowing. Every act of courage, no matter how small, creates ripples that can become waves. Every person who refuses to accept injustice, who stands up for what is right even when it's difficult, is part of a movement that is bigger than any one individual. He leaned closer to the camera, his intensity palpable. To the young Americans watching this, your country was built by people who refused to accept that things couldn't change. Use that same spirit to question, to demand better, to insist that your nation's power be used to lift up rather than exploit. To young Africans watching, you are descendants of people who built pyramids, who created universities, who developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that the world still uses today. The limitations placed on you are not natural. They are constructed, and what is constructed can be deconstructed. Steve was openly crying now, not caring about the cameras or the audience or his carefully maintained image. Something fundamental had shifted in this conversation, and he could feel it reverberating through the studio and, he suspected, through everyone watching. "Captain Ibrahim Traore," Steve said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. I want to thank you for your courage, for your sacrifice, and for reminding us that freedom isn't free anywhere in the world." Steve turned to face his audience, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief.
"Family, I got to be honest with you.
This wasn't the show I planned to do today. This young man has challenged me, has challenged all of us to think differently about the world we live in. And I'm grateful for that challenge." He turned back to the screen where Traoré was waiting patiently. "Captain, is there anything else you want to say before we end this?" Traoré nodded, and when he spoke, his voice carried a finality that suggested he understood the weight of this moment. "Mr. Harvey, to your audience, to the American people, I want to say this. We are not asking for charity. We are not asking for pity. We are asking for justice. We are asking for the same opportunity that every parent wants, to build a better life for our children in the land where we were born." He paused, his eyes seeming to look beyond the camera, beyond the studio, beyond the moment.
"The world is changing.
The old systems, the old ways of dividing the world into those who extract and those who are extracted from, are no longer sustainable. We can build something better together, but it requires courage from all of us. Courage to question what we've been told, courage to listen to voices that have been silenced, courage to choose justice over comfort." The satellite connection began to flicker more noticeably now, and Steve realized their time was ending.
"Captain Ibrahim Traore, may God bless you and keep you safe, brother."
"May God protect your family, and may God bless the people of Burkina Faso." "Thank you, Mr. Harvey. May God bless you and your family as well. And may God bless all those who choose to stand with the oppressed rather than the oppressor." The screen went dark, leaving Steve standing alone on his set, facing an audience that sat in stunned silence. For several minutes, nobody moved. The usual post-interview energy was absent. Instead, there was a profound sense that everyone in that studio had witnessed something historic. Steve walked back to his desk, but instead of sitting down, he remained standing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, deeper, more raw than his audience had ever heard. Family, I don't know what to say right now. I've been in this business a long time, and I thought I understood the world pretty well. But that young man just educated me in ways I never expected. He looked around the studio, making eye contact with audience members, many of whom were still crying. You know what hit me the most? When he talked about his daughter, about that question she asked him, "Papa, why do bad men want to hurt us because you want to help our people?" That's a question that should haunt every one of us. Because somewhere in the world, there's an 8-year-old girl who has to live with the knowledge that her father's life is in danger because he wants his people to control their own resources. Steve began pacing the stage, his energy building. We sit here in America, in this blessed country, and we complain about gas prices, we complain about taxes, we complain about politics. And I'm not saying those aren't real problems. But that man is living under death threats because he wants African children to have the same opportunities that we take for granted for our children. The studio remained silent, but Steve could feel the attention of every person in the room.
You know what else got to me?
When he talked about his friend, the engineer who's driving a taxi in Paris. How many African doctors are cleaning floors in European hospitals? How many African scientists are doing manual labor in American cities? How many African entrepreneurs are working in factories instead of building businesses in their own communities? Steve stopped pacing and faced his audience directly. And here's the part that really got to me. We've been told that this is just how things are. That some countries are rich and some are poor, that some people get opportunities and some don't. But what Captain Traoré is saying is that this isn't natural. It's not God's will or bad luck or laziness. It's a system that was designed to work this way. He shook his head, still processing what he had heard. I've interviewed presidents and prime ministers, CEOs and celebrities. Most of them are worried about their approval ratings or their stock prices or their next election. This young man is worried about whether his daughter will grow up free. There's a difference there that I can't ignore. Steve walked closer to the audience, his voice becoming more conversational but no less intense. Family, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. If you were born in Burkina Faso instead of America, if your children's futures depended on resources that foreign companies controlled, if speaking up for your people meant risking your life, what would you do? The question hung in the air, and Steve could see people genuinely considering it. Would you stay quiet and watch your children grow up in poverty while their inheritance gets shipped overseas? Or would you stand up and fight, knowing that it might cost you everything? Steve returned to his desk but remained standing behind it.
Captain Traore made a choice.
At 34 years old, with a young daughter, with everything to lose, he made a choice to stand up. And whether you agree with all his methods or not, whether you think he's got all the answers or not, you got to respect the courage it takes to make that choice. The studio audience began to stir slightly, some people nodding, others wiping their eyes. But here's what I want us to remember, Steve continued. This isn't just about Africa. This is about what we choose to stand for as human beings. This is about whether we're willing to look beyond our comfortable lives and see the struggles of people who don't have our advantages. Steve's voice was growing stronger now, taking on the cadence that had made him one of America's most beloved motivational speakers. Every one of us in this room has been blessed. We live in a country where we can speak our minds without fearing for our lives. We have opportunities that billions of people around the world can only dream of. But with those blessings comes responsibility. He pointed toward where Traoré's image had been on the screen. That young man is carrying the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. He's facing threats that would break most of us. But he's doing it because he believes that his daughter deserves better than what the previous generation accepted. Steve began walking among the audience now, something he rarely did during tapings. How many of us can say we're fighting that hard for our children's futures? How many of us are willing to sacrifice our comfort for our principles? How many of us are willing to risk anything real for what we say we believe in? He stopped next to a young woman in the front row who had been crying throughout the interview. You're crying because you felt something real, didn't you? You felt the pain in that man's voice when he talked about his daughter. You felt the weight of his grandmother's promise. You felt the injustice of systems that keep people poor while making others rich. The woman nodded, unable to speak.
That feeling, that is your conscience talking to you.
That's your soul recognizing truth when it hears it.
Don't let that feeling fade when you leave the studio.
Don't let it become just another emotional moment that you forget by next week. Steve returned to the center of the stage, his voice rising with passion.
Captain Traore challenged the Stati Uniti today.
He challenged us to question what we think we know about the world. He challenged us to look beyond the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about why some people have so much while others have so little. He paused, looking around the studio. But more than that, he challenged us to have courage. Not the courage to face death threats or military coups. Most of us will never face anything like that. But the courage to educate ourselves, to ask difficult questions, to support justice even when it's inconvenient. Steve's voice softened, becoming more personal. Family, I've been doing this show for years. I've tried to inspire people, to help them see possibilities in their lives. But today I got inspired.
Today, I met a young man who reminded me what real courage looks like.
He walked back to his desk and finally sat down, but his energy remained high. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, Steve, this is heavy. This isn't what I came here for. I wanted to laugh, I wanted to feel good, I wanted to escape from the problems of the world for a little while. And I understand that. I really do. Steve leaned forward, speaking directly to the camera. But sometimes, God puts something in your path that you can't ignore. Sometimes, you hear a story that changes how you see everything. Today was one of those days for me, and I hope it was one of those days for you too. He stood up again, his final energy building. Captain Ibrahim Traore is fighting for his people's freedom in Burkina Faso. But the principles he's fighting for, dignity, justice, self-determination, the right to control your own destiny, those principles don't have borders. Those principles matter everywhere. Steve looked directly into the main camera, speaking to the millions of people who would eventually see this interview. To everyone watching this, I want to leave you with this. That young man is willing to die for what he believes in. He's willing to risk everything for the chance that his daughter might grow up in a better world than the one he inherited. His voice grew quiet but intense.
What are you willing to risk for what you believe in?
What are you willing to sacrifice for your children's future?
What are you willing to do to make the world a little more just, a little more fair, a little more loving?
Steve paused for a long moment, letting the questions settle. Family, this has been one of the most powerful experiences of my career. I want to thank Captain Ibrahim Traore for his courage, for his honesty, and for reminding us that freedom is not a gift. It's something that every generation has to fight for. He looked around the studio one final time. We're going to take a break now, but when we come back, I want to talk about what we can do. I want to talk about how we can honor what we heard today by taking action in our own lives and our own communities. As the cameras stopped rolling, the studio remained unusually quiet. Nobody rushed to leave. Nobody immediately started chatting about what they would have for dinner or what they planned to do that evening. Instead, they sat in contemplation, processing what they had witnessed. Steve remained on stage, still emotional, still processing. Several audience members approached him, wanting to share how the interview had affected them. A young college student told him she was changing her major to international relations. An elderly woman said she was going to start researching where her everyday products came from and who profited from their production. But it was the comment from a middle-aged man that stayed with Steve long after everyone had gone home. "Mr. Harvey, I came here today expecting entertainment. Instead, I got an education and a challenge." That young man made me realize that I've been living like my comfort is more important than other people's freedom.
I cantido de tenimor.
As Steve finally left the studio that evening, he knew that something fundamental had changed. The interview with Captain Ibrahim Traore had not just been television. It had been a moment of truth that would ripple outward in ways none of them could predict. The show would air 3 days later, and the response would be unlike anything in the program's history. Social media would explode with conversations about African sovereignty, American foreign policy, and the courage required to challenge powerful systems. News outlets would analyze every word of Traore's statements. Universities would add the interview to their curricula on international relations and African studies. But more importantly, thousands of individual viewers would be changed by what they heard. They would begin asking questions they had never asked before. They would begin seeing connections they had never noticed. They would begin understanding that their own freedom and prosperity were connected to the freedom and prosperity of people they had never met in countries they had never visited. And in a small office in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traore would continue his work, knowing that somewhere in America, millions of people had heard his message and that some of them would be moved to action. The conversation was just beginning, but the seeds of change had been planted. The moment when Steve Harvey cried on television while listening to Ibrahim Traore would become more than just a viral clip or a memorable interview. It would become a symbol of what happens when truth cuts through the noise, when courage inspires courage, and when the comfortable are challenged to care about the uncomfortable truths of the world. As Steve would say in interviews months later, "That day changed me." That young man reminded me that television isn't just about entertainment. It's about using your platform to amplify voices that need to be heard. Captain Traore risked everything to tell his truth. The least I could do was listen, really listen, and help others hear it too. The legacy of that afternoon would extend far beyond the studio walls, touching lives and changing perspectives in ways that would continue to unfold for years to come. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful television happens when you stop trying to make television and start trying to change the world.